Good morning, everyone. My purpose today is to analyze Italian newspapers and magazines of the 1970s through an examination of the reviews they published. I will mainly focus on the articles dedicated to Sillabario numero 1 by Goffredo Parise, looking primarily at the newspapers and magazines published in Milan, the Italian capital city of the news industry since the beginning of the 20th century. But let's start from the end. On 20 December 1973, in the communist daily L'Unità, Vittorio Spinazzola signed the final assessment of the literary year. I quote, "From a literary point of view, 1973 was a year of widespread unease and discontent. There were no major events or debates. However, the echo of the polemics raised by Goffredo Parise at the end of 1972 in conjunction with the publication of one of his books of short stories continued to be heard. Very briefly, Parise was saying that it was time to devote himself less to the problems of collective life and more to the concerns of the private self. The rights of existence had to take precedence over the commitments of collective history. The delineation of this false alternative was evidently a bad symptom. Was Italian literature moving to the right? What Spinazzola argues is that those who write about feelings make right-wing literature, whereas left-wing literature should be concerned with the promise of collective life. Well, about a month later, in January 1974, the Milanese Corriere della Sera published a letter by a reader who wanted to share his concerns about the implication of Spinazzola's statement. I quote, "The way Spinazzola is framed the problem seems to me to be distorted. Feelings, for God's sake, are not concerns of the private self. It as would re-evaluating feelings mean reawakening individualism, or is it not the usual academic confusion between individualism and individuality? Talking about feelings means being right-wing, but then does being left-wing then only mean making economic calculations?" In a reply to Roberto Lamantea, the writer Natalia Ginsburg stated that it was difficult to give an unequivocal answer. The relationship of each person with the commitments of collected history is something very delicate and complex, and should carefully be considered. I quote, "It has been said that it was good feeling fiction, and therefore false because since good feelings do not exist anymore or are few, so the telling of them today appears to be a lie and a falsification. So when we say good feelings, we mean false good feelings. But those who have placed Parise's stories in the narrative of good feelings, that is, in a type of idyllic and sentimental romance novels, either have not read them or have made a mistake. Because, in truth, there are no good feelings in Parise's stories." Well, clarified at this point, she reiterates a positive judgment of Parise's work, and that's what, in her opinion, right and left mean in literature. To the words right and left, when they are not used in contingent facts, but in the area of the absolute, each one gives his own meaning. For me, everything that is false is right, everything that is true is left. For whatever is true takes the word forward, whatever is false takes it backwards. This may appear to be a crude and simplistic definition, because in reality distinguishing the true from the false is the most complicated thing in the world. However, there is no possible doubt that man is in the world to try to distinguish the true from the false. Well, to propose this is commitment, to disregard it is disengagement. If this is the case, and this is the implicit conclusion of Ginsburg's speech, Parise would be a very committed and left-wing author, the exact opposite of how he was originally labeled. But how did we get to apply strictly political categories to literary facts? A year and a half earlier, major national newspapers had reported Parise's latest publication, and many reviewers had tried to explain the title. According to Paolo Milano's reviews, Parise wanted to revise and reformulate life keywords, and thus achieve a recovery of feelings and therefore of poetry. To emphasize this interpretation of the work, the cover featured the large red heart wrought by leaves, feathers and stones. A quote on the book flap also stated that the meaning of the story was in a climate of sensual enchantment, and the theme addressed in the volume was that of the mystery of the feelings of beauty. Parise described the genesis of the project in an interview granted to the Gazzettino. I quote, "The book was born like this. In the years between 68 and 70, in the midst of ideological contestation in such politicized times, I felt a great need for simple words. One day, in the square below my house, on a bench, I see a child with a syllabary. I pick it and read, 'The grass is green.' It seemed to me a very beautiful and poetic sentence, in its simplicity but also in its logic. There was life in that grass is green, the essentiality of life and also of poetry. I thought of Tolstoy, who had written a reading book not only for children. I thought that they had forgotten that the grass is green, that man's feelings are eternal, and that ideologies pass away. Therefore, Parise proposes a return to feelings, which are opposed by their very essence to the ideologies. The entire authorial and editorial paratext cover titled Flap reinforces this reading key. However, something went wrong in the meanwhile. The publication of the book occurred by chance in a cultural context characterized by the outbreak of a strong-toned controversy between an engaged and a disengaged idea of literature. Parise was stigmatized as a reactionary and champion of disengagement. While, as Lorenzo Cardilli states, critics have at their disposal 5 different hermeneutical devices to deal with the text. It has the interpretive description, selection, explicit evaluation, comparison and framing. As far as the syllabario reviews are concerned, the device most used by critics is that of framing, a device aimed to provide the text with a context and to read it at the light of this frame. This frame, as in this case, could be, of course, far from literary values. The debate on syllabario swings between politics and literature, between private feelings and social commitment. Parise is mostly defined as a reactionary. Ideological elements overcome artistic and literary consideration. In addition to reconstruction of the operation carried out by Parise in the collection, with the related description of the structure of the work and the stance taken in the debate that has arisen around the Parise case, there would be a third element present in the vast majority of the reviews, that is, a comparison of syllabario with the works preceding it. It has, from the surprising debut of Ragazzo morto e le comete in 1951 to the works of social protest of the 60s, compared to which, according to the opinion of several critics, syllabario would constitute a turning point in Parise's literary path. This is what emerged from an analysis of the reviews in the most authoritative newspaper of the time. However, the situation in magazine, the most widespread periodical at the time, is quite different. As Piccone, Stella and Rossi pointed out in their survey on the diffusion of reading in the early 60s, few books are read, few newspapers are bought, instead a lot of magazines are bought and read. Therefore, the place they occupy among the sources of information and culture is privileged. They come immediately after cinema and television, in a position of clear detachment from the others. Secondly, Piccone, Stella and Rossi claim that a weekly magazine contains proportionally fewer political articles than a daily newspaper, or it could be said that the distinctly political weeklies are the least sold, so that the choice of the weekly is therefore much easier than that of the daily, and does not definitely commit the reader. Having largely renounced political commitment, however, Piccone, Stella and Rossi find that magazines have achieved a leveling of services and news, so much so that there is a widespread impression among readers that one is worth the other. As one sales representative confesses when asked about the criteria that guide his choice when buying weeklies, I quote, "Look, I'm interested in all the weeklies. I usually buy one, the first one that comes my way. Well, maybe I base my choice on something a bit puerile, the sticker, the printed front page, for example. I see a beautiful half-naked girl and I buy it." Nevertheless, the most widespread weeklies were Mondadori's Epoca, Oggi, L'Europeo, followed by the Tempo and L'Espresso. It is no coincidence that the most of these periodicals were based in Milan. These magazines enjoy enormous indiscriminate popularity. Moreover, compared to the newspaper, the magazine, thanks to its often first-rate media, offers the reader more opportunities to relax, distract, and escape by viewing beautiful photographs of distant countries and reading exhaustive biographies of famous people. In short, according to Piccone Stella and Rossi, if reading a newspaper is hardly ever a pleasure, reading a magazine almost always is. As mentioned above, Syllabario was reviewed by some of the most popular weekly newspapers of the time. Now I will focus on the review published on Epoca and signed by Luigi Baldacci. Among the magazines, one that stands out is Mondadori's Epoca, which at its launch in 1950 had already distinguished itself as the most modern and innovative title, inspired by the American magazine look. The weekly dedicated a wealth of information to books, with little interest in military intervention or critical debate, and managed to maintain a policy of reviews free from influence of the director's publishing house, i.e. Mondadori. The magazine's contributors include Geno Pampaloni, Alfonso Gatto, as well as Luigi Baldacci, a militant critic and free independent university professor, who cultivated literary interests ranging from Italian literature from the 16th, 19th centuries to contemporary foreign literature. As for his collaboration with the daily and periodical press, in the 1950s and the 1960s, he published reviews and portrayed in many venues, favoring among them Belfagor, radio shows such as La Prodo, and weeklies such as Epoca. Baldacci's first aim when confronted with Syllabario was to verify the correspondence between intention and realization, and the critic identified a strong discrepancy between them. Judging from the editorial presentation, in fact, the reader would have the right to believe that the book in front of him is collected of morals, fables, and judicious apologies. In reality, the author's words, as often happens, are somewhat misleading, as Syllabario is anything but a collection of feelings illustrated in the form of example, as if the sentiment were something that lies outside the story, and the story constituted its witty caption. Having warned the reader not to put too much trust in the partext, identifies the highest quality of the text in the revealing capacity of Parise's writing, capable of tuning the rhythm of narration to the rhythm of life. Noting affinities and differences with psychological realism, insists on the existential vein of a work without full-blown characters and articulated plots, all centered on minimal events and limit of gestures, capable of showing the moments when even life is beautiful. Such Parisian skills demonstrates the existence and fortune of a narrative as nascent invention. Reading this text gives the impression that even the reviews in the weeklies try to become entertainment and amusement, and not pure information and criticism. Although the critics are often the same as those who have animated the literary pages of the daily newspapers in recent decades, I would argue that the paper is stronger than the sign. Furthermore, the apoliticality of the weeklies allowed for a reviewing free of politics and therefore guaranteed a more effective review. Well, among the readers of Parise's short stories there were also Mario Spinella on the magazine Rinascita and Mario Pancera on the Milanese newspaper Corriere della Sera, authors of two reviews that for different reasons can be considered borderline reviews. I will analyze them in place of providing some conclusions. Let's start with the Spinella article. He and Parisi met a few times, including once in Milan bookshop when Spinella presented the novel Il Padrone, and once in Palermo, at a meeting of the Gruppo 63, in which Parisi, like many others, participated as a critical spectator. They did not know each other well, but these meetings were enough to provoke in Spinella what he calls a lively sympathy. In the light of this, the critic of Rinascita decided to dedicate something different from the traditional review to the 1972 work. Spinella writes, "The need arose in me to address you in the more direct form of an open letter, instead of contenting myself with one of my usual cursory reviews. It is not only, of course, a question of space, but of language, of tone. I will tell you things on which I believe you will not be able to agree." This means that the reviewer does not talk with his or usual interlocutor. It has the reader, but with the author of the book reviewed. It has the object of the review. Different is the case of Pancera review. He puts the reader in the position of approaching Parisi's text with respect. How else can one behave in front of short stories of a few pages worked on for years and years? According to Pancera, these tales, apparently different from each other, are like the fragments of mirror with which Enrico Bais builds on the canvas some of his incredible human monsters. In each one we discover something of ourselves, and yet this quite exceptional comparison coexists peacefully with expressions that have another degree of conventionality. Every story is an adventure. Adventure in little things. A look, a caress, a sudden thought which put together delineate common feelings, in the sense that most of us have them, but which become extraordinary when they are used by a writer who, like an ant, ramages through the character of man in an attempt to grasp their spirit. At the point of having to express an explicit judgment, however, the reviewer stops and states, "The readers will judge themselves, comparing the small great adventures of their own personal human itinerary with those described by Parisi." Rhetoric or actual derogation? It is difficult to answer. Thank you for your attention.